Welcome everyone to our webinar today, where we have CMS Cloud Mastery, overcoming migration challenges with Diagram and Umbraco. My name is Karen, and I head up our marketing efforts here with Umbraco in the U.S. So happy to have you here. Just a few housekeeping notes before we do our speaker introduction. Just want to share with you that today's event is being recorded, so that after we're completed today, I'm happy to share that. Keep an eye out on that. Also, if you do have a question for today's speaker, feel free to drop a question, the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And aside from that, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We are absolutely thrilled to have Chris Oosterhout, who is our Senior Vice President of Strategy at Diagram. Chris brings a great deal of experience in digital transformation with expertise in leveraging cloud CMS platforms to drive business growth and enhance user experience. So we're hoping today that you will enjoy his insights that are going to be providing invaluable guidance for anyone involved in or who might be considering the transition to a cloud CMS. So we are very excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Chris, it's my pleasure to say good morning, and how's it going?
Good morning. Thanks, Karen. I appreciate it. And thanks for joining, everyone. As Karen mentioned, my name is Chris Oosterhout, and today we're going to walk through a variety of challenges and solutions for organizations considering moving to a cloud-based CMS platform. We'll cover different areas, including the CMS landscape as it exists today, identifying common challenges and strategic execution strategies, technical considerations, and post-migration optimization. As Karen mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And there'll be a section at the end of the presentation where we can answer those. And for those of you that sent over questions at the beginning and prior to the webinar, we'll make sure to answer those questions as well during that time frame. All right, let's get started. So the CMS landscape in general is fairly complex. This is primarily due to all the terminology used around platforms, whether it's a CMS or a cloud CMS, digital experience platform, composable DXP, etc. And I think this causes a lot of confusion for organizations and their ability to determine the differences between the platforms to help them choose the right platform for their business. But when you peel back all of the kind of marketing language, et cetera, they really kind of fall into two primary categories. So those are platform as a service, which is commonly referred to as PaaS, and software as a service, which is primarily referred to as SaaS. And this terminology is used to explain two things. One is how the product is packaged together with the software licensing, if that's applicable, the infrastructure, and any sort of maintenance that might be included with the product itself, as well as your ability to control and customize the end solution on your own. And so as you try to determine the difference between a software as a solution provider and a platform as a solution provider, it really falls into four main areas. One is control and customization, management and maintenance, extensibility, and then obviously infrastructure handling. So I'm going to talk about these at a very high level. And if you have questions about this, I'm happy to discuss it at the end. But as you compare the two types of products against each other, a platform as a service provider is essentially a customizable framework that deals with infrastructure, the licensing, et cetera. But you have an exorbitant amount of control over, how that might be configured, how big or small the implementation is, those types of things. Whereas on the software as a service side, they're really billed more as turnkey solutions, meaning that you have very little control over the infrastructure and they manage everything else. So from a maintenance perspective, when you think about platform as a service, they're doing a few things. They're managing the infrastructure, of course, so that would be the hosting. They're managing the CMS application itself, as well as a variety of patching for the CMS. So if you're on a content management system today, that might be, many versions behind. Platform as a service providers almost always install security updates within the platform as a service is provided. And many of them even offer the ability to install feature upgrades, which are optional. The reason they're optional is because organizations tend to want to control the features coming into the solution, meaning if you install a feature update, it might break something that's custom coded, as an example. Or you may not want to take a feature right now because you want to train your staff. Whereas software as a service, you have no control over when those updates come in. It's not a bad thing. It's just if you have an organization that has a lower tolerance for change, so if you have 200 people that manage your website and they're trained on how to manage the website, and on Monday morning they come in to work and things have changed in the back office and they can no longer edit the website the way they know how. Those are considerations when determining the difference between the two platforms and which ones might make sense for your business. If you have a website that has heavy amounts of customization, a platform as a service provider might be the right choice for you, meaning if you have a lot of integration work, platform as a service offers you the ability to write your own APIs if you need to integrate with the APIs, you can change the back office to a certain extent. Whereas software as a service providers, they do offer a robust series of APIs, but what you see is what you get. So what I mean by that is if you want to do something outside of the box, then you're either forced to develop your own middleware to kind of dissect the data before you push it into the system, or you can't do it. And so that's a consideration for many organizations, but realize that for 80% of the organizations out there, software as a service APIs that are available are just sufficient. And lastly, infrastructure handling is a critical decision point between the two types of products. And so if you're a global organization and you have the desire to say, we want to have a node of our content existing in Europe, and we want the data to stay in Europe, and we want a node of the website in the US, and we want everyone else that's not in Europe to be routed to the US and the data will be constrained there, then you want to look at something like a platform as a service where you have more functionality and control over that. Software as a service, you don't historically have control over which regions that your website is hosted in. And also, if you want to slice and dice how that is distributed, you often don't have that flexibility either. So you might be thinking to yourself, what about headless? So there's platform as a service. I know a lot about headless. I'm hearing a lot about that. And the reality is headless platforms, 99% of the time would fall into the SaaS, software as a service category. And for the unique use cases for many organizations that actually require SaaS, there's one thing I did want to share, which is almost every CMS platform available, cloud-based or otherwise, offers some level of content delivery APIs and content management APIs, meaning if you have an organization that has headless aspirations, you can still use your traditional CMS functionality and use headless features when it makes sense for your business. All right. So now that we kind of understand the CMS landscape, let's dig into a little bit about the challenges that organizations face when they're considering or embarking on a cloud CMS migration. These primarily fall in three categories, and we'll discuss each one of them, but they're going to be strategic, technical, and cultural. So from a strategic perspective, some of the challenges that organizations run into more often than not is kind of the philosophy, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Meaning, hey, the website works today. Why would we migrate it, spend the money, make the investment, take the time to migrate to a new cloud platform? And I think that when you look at things in that light, it's not very strategic. So as the global economic conditions change, as businesses grow, there's going to become a time where an organization needs to do something quickly. That could be spinning up a multi-site environment. It could be rolling out a new e-commerce website. It could be launching new products or landing pages, running campaigns. And statistically speaking, that work can happen significantly faster in a cloud-based environment. And when 2 weeks durations to 2 months durations for deployments can cost companies millions of dollars, moving to the cloud sooner rather than later is definitely advantageous for organizations. The next challenge that we hear a lot about is cost variability, which is from a cloud perspective. When cloud solutions were first available, there was a lot of buzz about, hey, maybe we should move to the cloud because you only pay for what you use. And in those scenarios, it was quickly followed by, oh no, like we have no idea how much it's going to cost us every month. What if we get a lot of traffic and the website's really busy? Are we going to pay thousands of dollars a month for cloud pricing? And the reality is, none of that was ever really true. So if you look at a cloud-based provider like Umbraco Cloud, you go onto the website, you pick the package that's right for your organization based on the size and scalability that you require. And let's say it's $800 a month. That's the most you'll ever pay is $800 a month. So there is no variability in the costs. And even if you're hosting in your own Azure fabric, as an example, in those scenarios, you would just say, I'm assuming my website is running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What is the cost for that? And then you know that is the most that you would possibly pay per month. And so the cost variability concern is really not what it used to be. The next two strategic areas that I think organizations struggle with are really kind of joined at the hip. So long-term vendor strategy, which is the perception of vendor lock-in. So if you're looking at a product like Umbraco, a lot of times organizations say, like, what if Umbraco is not here in a couple of years? And that ties directly into platform viability. And I think there's two ways to kind of look at this. The first way that I always recommend is that if you look past the CMS platform you're selecting and ask the question, what technology framework are they using to power their CMS platform? In Umbraco's case, it's Microsoft. And Microsoft, their websites are running on Microsoft Azure. And so in those scenarios, you ask yourself, is Microsoft going away anytime soon? Definitely not. They're one of the most known companies in the world, and they're one of the most wealthy companies in the world. They're making huge investments in their cloud environments. And so I would say it's a pretty safe bet that Microsoft as an undersigning framework makes the product itself viable. And then you could take a look at, okay, do you have a vibrant community of people that use the platform, the CMS platform itself? What are people saying about that? So looking at crowdsourced review sites like G2 Crowd. And then how many implementations are there worldwide? You know, if you're looking at hundreds of thousands of implementations on the CMS, I think you can check the box of viability and lack of vendor lock-in. Strategically speaking, a lot of organizations are focused on sustainability goals, and at the forefront of those discussions is managing the IT footprint, meaning how do we reduce our IT footprint? And I think cloud migrations fit very well into those goal categories. And lastly, from a global data governance perspective, as the data laws continue to evolve around the world, partnering with organizations like Microsoft, as an example, or Umbraco, which is a global company, they have a lot of this kind of figured out, which makes that process a lot easier for organizations that are embarking on these challenges. All right, so now that we understand strategically what organizations kind of run into, let's talk about some of the technical things which every organization runs across as they're considering a cloud migration. And we are going to be digging in a little bit later in the presentation into these technical issues specifically. So I'll just kind of talk about them at a high level here, but data and security, privacy is always at the forefront of every organization's mind. So it's always something that comes up, and we'll talk about how to mitigate and work through those challenges together. Existing system integration. So if you have existing systems that integrate with the website, how would you do that in the cloud? Internal staff, cloud expertise. And so what I mean by that is a lot of times there's not a lot of experience inside of organizations of how the cloud works. It's not just IT staff, it's also could be marketers, it could be C-suite executives. They're not totally clear on the cloud, so that often presents a challenge from a training perspective. Platform performance and scalability. These things are concerns and challenges in any infrastructure. I would say that they are substantially easier to manage in a cloud-based environment from a scalability perspective. Backup and recovery is a technical challenge that the organizations have. And I think that this has been a big education process for a lot of organizations where in a traditional hosting model, as an example, if you have a website and all your infrastructure, say in a Chicago data center, and you're concerned, like, how do we fail over to say a Texas data center in the case of a disaster? You know, people are doing that every day. Organizations are doing that every day successfully, but it is a lot of work. When you get into a cloud-based environment, all of a sudden there are things when you set up your web apps that say, hey, I'd like to be in 3 regions: West Coast, Central, Central, and East Coast. And you check those boxes and your apps are distributed. Or if you want global redundancy on your asset storage, you just check a box and it becomes globally redundant. So things that were very complicated in traditional hosting models are much more simple in cloud-based models. And lastly, control and customization of environments. So as the traditional hosting configuration is concerned, there were a lot of needs for customization of environments and control. As you move to the cloud, and many of the solutions are web-based, web app-based, you run into a scenario where these things are no longer concerns. So you don't have operating systems, you don't have Windows updates, you don't have antivirus. So a lot of the things that require control and customization kind of fall off the radar as you move into cloud-based environments. But once we kind of understand the technical challenges, a lot of the cultural challenges within organizations are very similar. So for example, we talked about the if it's not broke, don't fix it, resistance to change kind of mentality. That often ties together with the skill gaps that we were discussing. And so as organizations are not totally clear on how to calculate total cost of ownership for a cloud migration or even for their existing systems, or they're not sure how taking advantage of cloud environments will bring ROI to their business, that often creates a scenario where there's an education process that needs to take place to help organizations understand the value of moving to cloud systems. With everything going on in the economy, there's always the fear of job loss. I think that you've seen a lot of IT companies, I think we all have around the world, laying off employees in large quantities. And I think that that's not because these organizations all of a sudden went to the cloud. This is because of the introduction of AI and other things that are causing them to reduce their staff in certain areas for tasks that were used to be very manual that are now automated. When we talk to organizations about cloud migrations, our focus is not about how do we take the 3 employees that were working on the infrastructure for the website and help you get rid of them. The idea is that we want to say now they don't need to be distracted by what's going on with the website, and they can focus on something that brings more value to your business and your customers. So for example, if you're in the healthcare space, rather than these 3 individuals being distracted with the infrastructure for a digital property, they're working hand in hand with the rest of the team to say store teraplots of data for MRI reports so that the radiologist can read it sooner and that the patient can be treated sooner. Security concerns are always a concern no matter where the website is hosted. But you do find that the ability to scale security measures in the cloud, which are a click away, don't require physical hardware, those types of things are often mitigated pretty quickly. And the last 2 items in the cultural change category would be perception of loss of control. If you're an organization where you still need certain levels of control, then a platform as service is probably the right solution for you. If you are an organization where you don't need it, you're a very marketing centric website, you don't have a large IT team internally, you don't have the cloud skill set, then something like a software as a service solution would definitely be more in that alignment. And lastly, I think that attachment to legacy systems is something where they see it as a challenge, but I often see this as the biggest opportunity. So for example, if you work in an organization where you have internal systems they're old, so maybe it's an old ERP that only can move data around with flat files, so CSVs, Excel files, that kind of stuff. That ERP will eventually go away. It may not be today, it may not be next year, but there's going to be a point in time where that ERP no longer functions. And so it's a great opportunity to build a middleware apparatus as an organization to say, let's take that data, put it in a relational database, and then build an API layer to disseminate it to our websites. And so where this often is seen as a challenge, I really do feel like it's an opportunity. All right, so let's dive into some of the strategic planning and execution areas when you're thinking about a cloud CMS migration. With all of the projects that we deal with for cloud migrations, I would say that there are 4 areas and maybe 4 top issues that organizations face that slow down the execution of these projects, or in many cases cause them to false start. And we'll dig into each of these independently, but at a high level, there's not understanding the data constraints within the organization, not having a clear project approach, underestimating the resource needs and expertise for the organization, and budget. So when it comes to data, it's really important for you to understand the data constraints that you have for your website. So for example, I would ask these questions internally. What type of data does your website store? Are you storing healthcare data like HIPAA related data? Are you processing credit cards on the website? Are you storing any sort of PII related data? Knowing the answer to that question is going to definitely shape the type of solution in the cloud provider that you're going to be able to choose from. It narrows the field substantially. Then you have to ask yourself, what security and compliance regulations are you bound to? So for example, if you are processing credit cards on your website, there's a high probability that you need PCI compliancy. And so when you look at those two things together, that's something to consider. What business associate agreements do you already have in place? So for example, if you have an agreement with Microsoft, then choosing, if you have a BAA already negotiated with Microsoft, then choosing a CMS cloud platform that is based on the Microsoft framework might make a lot of sense for your business and definitely help streamline your data constraint concerns. And lastly, do you have data sovereignty and localization constraints? Do you have to store some data, say, in a European data center versus some in a US-based data center? So understanding the answers to these questions is critical when you start selecting which platform makes sense for your organization. So once you understand your data constraints, it's really important to understand what type of project that you'll be undertaking. And so with all of the projects that we've done over the years, we found that they really fall into three categories. So if you're on say you're on Umbraco today, and you're considering, maybe you're hosting at Rackspace, you're hosting internally at your office, and you're considering a migration to Umbraco Cloud, that's one type of project. You're not redesigning it, same functionality, same version, same everything. We often call that lifting and shifting from one environment to another. That is the least risky project, will take the least amount of time, and you'll see ROI the fastest, okay? The next type of project, which is unbelievably common, is that organizations might be on a current platform, let's just say it's WordPress, and you'd like to migrate to Umbraco Cloud. You're not redesigning anything, you're rebuilding all the same functionality you have today, but you're migrating from WordPress to Umbraco Cloud. And lastly, the largest of the three types of projects would be, hey, we're doing a redesign. We're also moving from one platform to Umbraco Cloud. So let's say you're moving from Sitecore to Umbraco Cloud, and you want to do a website redesign along with that process. This is not a complicated process. You just have to plan for the fact that it's going to take more time. It's going to take more stakeholder buy-in. It's going to take more stakeholder feedback, those types of things. And so normally one of those three project types are what your migration will be. And before we move on, there's one small thing I did want to mention, is that if you are hearing in your project plan that we want to, say, adopt a new platform, so from WordPress to Umbraco Cloud, and we want to do a light redesign or a reskin, I have never come across the project where that ended up being true. Once you start changing the design of a website, it snowballs pretty quickly and it turns into more of a full redesign. So I guess what I'm saying here is, if you hear those words in your project plan, then I would plan for a project that's probably much larger than you're anticipating, more expensive, and something that will take more time than you originally planned for. So once you know what type of migration you're undertaking, then you can kind of understand your resource needs and constraints. And here's why it's really important. So it's not just if you're partnering with an external agency, you have to worry about those resources. If there are internal resources being assigned to a project, they probably already have full-time jobs, meaning putting a project on top of their current full-time job may create other snowball effects internally. So you have to understand, hey, do we have the availability of the resources, and what might not get done that they're working on as a result of them being engaged with this project. You have to be honest with yourself as an organization and understand, do we have the expertise internally Do we understand best practices for cloud migrations? And if you don't, then you need to partner with an organization that does have that expertise so they can help you bring the project across the finish line successfully. This is one of the areas where I find that most organizations fall short. They're like, we went to a couple conferences, we understand the cloud, we should be good. And that's not really, usually doesn't turn out to be true. So integration work, the other area is that integration work normally requires both internal resources at your organization and external resources from a partner. So for example, perhaps the internal team is writing an API layer to push the data to the cloud-based system. And the agency partner might be working to consume that information within the website. And so normally planning for internal and external resources is really important. And lastly, content migration, whether you're scripting the content or migrating it by hand, requires resources, and it's probably the number one overlooked resource need on any project for any organization. And the number one area that sets projects back for organizations is not knowing what the budget for the project should be. And I'm not talking about creating an RFP and sending it to 10 companies to try to figure out what it should cost. I mean, as an organization, when you want to embark on this project, you need to identify a problem within the organization that a cloud migration will solve for you. And then you need to identify what level of investment are you willing to make in order to solve that problem for your business. And that's important because that sets the baseline foundation for your budget. And as you're budgeting, there are a few things that you want to consider that require budget in a cloud migration. So first off is the hosting infrastructure. So if you're doing Azure implementation or you're going to Umbraco Cloud, as an example, AWS, et cetera. So there's costs related monthly, annually for those. If you are migrating from one system like WordPress to Umbraco, there's going to be an implementation cost. Somebody's doing the implementation, whether it's internal resources or an external partner. So that's going to cost. And then if you have integrations with digital asset management products or middleware or product information management systems, those integrations will also require investment. The integration portion could be upwards of 30% of your budget if there's a lot of them and they're complex. You need to account for software and add-on licensing fees. So if you're working with if you're selected a platform that has ongoing software costs, not just infrastructure costs, you need to account for those. And then account for any add-on licensing you might need and understand, is this licensing a one-time fee? Is it a monthly investment? Is it an annual investment? Those types of things. In content migration, again, if you're scripting content, it's going to take time and resources. If you're manually migrating content, it's going to take time and resources. So understanding that those need to be budgeted for. And lastly, which is an area which is very surprising, but we run onto it more often than not, is budgeting for deployment and post-go live support. And so a lot of times if an organization has an internal IT team and they're partnering with an external agency, the IT team assumes that the external agency is deploying the website into its final resting place in the cloud. The agency might assume that the internal IT team is deploying to the cloud. And so making sure, that that's clear in your contractual agreements, but also that that is accounted for somewhere is really important, as well as the post-go live support. So we briefly talked on some of the technical issues and challenges that organizations run across. So let's jump into kind of solving some of those here together today. So when it comes to technical considerations, security compliance is always the first thing that comes up. Anytime you're talking about moving to a cloud, it sets off a bunch of flares and everybody starts talking about security and compliance. So I think it's really important as a first step in the process to understand the security scope for your website. And I think the easiest way to do that is to ask yourself the following questions. So is my website really storing sensitive data, or is it simply a marketing site? So for example, if your organization happens to process credit cards somewhere, there's probably a security requirement or compliance requirement that you're PCI compliant. But if your website doesn't store or process any credit cards, do you really fall in scope for that compliancy and security regulation? So understanding, really what you're doing with the website and what data you have is critical. The next question would be, do you need a solution in place for multi-factor or two-factor authentication? Now, this is tricky because the quick answer most organizations will say is yes, we have an organizational policy that you need two-factor authentication for all logins. But if you peel that back and say, well, we have two people that manage the website, is it worth X amount of dollars in investment to have two-factor authentication for these two individuals? If you have 200 people managing the website, absolutely, it makes total sense. But for two people, maybe you can get an exception and save the money for something else. Do you have any sort of internal systems that need to connect, and are there existing APIs for those? So if you have APIs, so anytime you poke a hole in a firewall to allow connection, that usually raises security eyebrows. So making sure that you understand, are there APIs available for this data is critical. More often than not, organizations kind of fall into the do as we say, not as we do situation. I was on a call a couple of weeks ago with an organization, and the IT security folks were saying things like, yes, the website needs to require a password change every 30 days. And then I asked a person on the telephone, I said, hey, when's the last time you had to change your Active Directory password? And they said, we haven't changed our password in 18 months. So that's one of those scenarios where you can often fall into the trap where we have a policy, this is what it must do, but in practice on the ground, that's not really happening. So those are important conversations to have, and they will change the scope of the overall implementation. And lastly, do you have a BAA in place with any of the infrastructure service providers? So I'm not talking about with Umbraco, I'm talking about with Microsoft. And if you do already, that really makes the security compliance conversation go a lot more smoothly from an IT perspective. So once you tackle the technical concerns, then the question is, how do we move all the data from our existing systems and integrate it with the new systems? And I think that it's really important to kind of understand a few things. The first thing is content scripting from one system to another can be expensive and risky, but it can be done strategically. I caution you not to fall into the trap where maybe an organization says, like, we'll just move all your content programmatically from your current system to your new system. That rarely works out well or works out the way that you intended. But strategically speaking, there are things that make sense to script from one system to another. So for example, if you have structured content like press releases, news articles, or blog content as an example, those often are great candidates for scripting because they're heavily structured. Things like home pages and landing pages and hub pages, those things will probably be controlled in a very different way in your new system. And so you would probably want to move those over by hand because the cost to script them would well outweigh the time it would take to just move them by hand. The next big consideration is that as an organization, removing the notion of flat file delivery from your organizational vocabulary. Meaning if that's the way you move content or data between systems today, it's not the way you're going to do it in the future. And so it's very important to consider as you're moving to the cloud to start to utilize API endpoints to communicate between systems, both for security purposes and scalability purposes. It's pretty critical. The next area is you really need to establish a plan for what data needs to actually be stored in the CMS versus simply transmitted from the CMS. Let me explain. So historically speaking, on legacy systems, if let's say you had a web form and you submitted the web form and there was an option to store the data in the CMS and send an email. In the new world, there's probably a connector that just will send the data directly to your CRM. So it doesn't need to be stored in the CMS or migrated to the CMS, but it does need to be integrated with your CRM. That not only shortens the time frame from the submission on the website to the customer being dealt with within your organization, but also starts to reduce the scope of compliancy for data storage because you're not storing it inside of the website. You're simply transmitting it from the website. And lastly, and most importantly, I think, establishing a regression testing plan for post-data migration. So regardless if you're moving product information for an e-commerce website, or you're moving 1,000 or 2,000 pages of content from the website, you need a plan in place to know hey, all of the content was migrated successfully. Did the metadata come over the way that we wanted for SEO? Do the pages have all the headers, the H1s and the H2s structured in the way that they need to be so that we don't have an SEO problem when we go live? Is the sitemap being generated with the most current content? That kind of stuff. And so making sure you have established a regression testing plan is extremely important. So the last thing I want to cover before we dig into any of the questions that folks have are post-migration optimization ideas. And the reality is, when you look at return on investment, many of the things organizations don't realize ROI until the website is actually live on the cloud-based platform. And so when you get to the cloud-based platform, what are the types of things you should do to not only protect yourself and optimize things, but start to realize return on investment from the migration process? So the first thing you want to do at a minimum is to establish a baseline for technical SEO issues prior to the migration process. And so there are a lot of tools out there that'll help you do this. If you're not sure what they are, you can post a question. I'm happy to answer it, or you can follow up after the session. But the idea would be that you're establishing a baseline so you know if you have technical SEO issues. Then ideally, as part of the migration process, you're solving those technical SEO issues. But more importantly, monitoring for any increases in those issues, immediately following the subsequent weeks following the go live, to make sure that you didn't create more problems accidentally with the migration process. The second area is to establish a CDN strategy. And so a lot of organizations, they don't lead the initial release with a CDN strategy because it can be complicated. If you have a marketing-centric website that has personalization and you're doing page level caching, how do you deal with content delivery networks? Do you want to store just assets inside of a content delivery network, but maybe not the pages? If you have an e-commerce website, you can't cache shopping carts, things of that nature. But implementing a content delivery network not only enhances your security, but it also will enhance your organic SEO because it'll return things faster based on where the users are around the world. The next area to focus on is establishing a first-party data solution for analytics and personalization. So with all the data privacy regulations changing around the world, even in the United States, you see many states moving on their own, like California, Virginia, et cetera, implementing third-party data constraints for tracking and analytics. Many of these cloud-based providers have solutions baked into the platform or have plugins for other platforms that will help solve this problem for you. So whether that's a CDP or whether it's a third-party plugin like Umbraco Suite, these products are built to solve the first-party data issues that organizations are facing every day. And so establishing that first-party data issue or solution will definitely solve the issues that organizations are having. And lastly, if your organization is looking to move to a more proactive rather than a reactive approach to website health, to establish a monitoring tool for website health, such as the New Relic or Application Insights, which is a Microsoft product. These tools will help you monitor not only, hey, are there issues happening with the website that we're not aware of, but also give you invaluable insights into our customers receiving the things that they're actually looking for when they load a page and that kind of stuff. So really taking advantage of some of the tools that are available from the cloud-based providers is critical in a post-migration phase. So that was a lot of information in a short period of time. So I wanted to sum it up for you real quick before we get to the questions. The first thing you got to do is make sure that you're selecting a CMS that makes sense for your business. So for example, if you can manage continuous release upgrades in the CMS every 6 weeks, then a platform as a service provider is probably the right choice for you. It's important not to let internal culture dissuade you from a cloud CMS migration. In reality, it's probably the least risky and the easiest of all the cloud migrations your organization is going to undertake, and is often the catalyst for moving other things to the cloud. So don't let internal culture dissuade you from that migration process. Establish your budget upfront and understand what kind of project you're undertaking. So if you're doing a redesign, understand the budget's going to be a lot higher than it would be if you're doing a simple lift and shift. Don't fall into the do as we say, not as we do trap. We talked about that. And once the migration is complete, the project isn't over. Really understanding the value that organizations can earn and get from cloud-based migrations is more critical than ever. All right, I know that we have some questions from folks that submitted them before the webinar, so I'd like to address those first, and then we'll tackle any other questions that came in during the webinar itself. Arliss,
Okay,
would you mind
Chris.
sharing some of those questions? Thanks, Arliss.
Yep, no problem. So what approach would you take to selecting the right cloud CMS for a business?
That's a great question, and we covered some of these topics today. And I think that understanding what type of functionality does your website require? And so, what I would advise against is what I call feature shopping, which is where organizations fall into the trap of either looking at an analyst report and rolling over to the top right corner or the furthest part of the wave and picking a platform saying these guys are best of breed. That usually falls into a situation where you're paying for software that you're not using. I would say that if your organization is using 60 to 80% of the functionality for a cloud provider, then you're probably in the sweet spot with an understanding that if you need to add more functionality, you can scale into that as you go forward. And then take a look at some of the things we discussed around, viability of the platform. Is the foundation of it running on from a company and a platform that you can stand behind, like Microsoft? Are users of the platform saying great things about it on social review sites like G2 Crowd? Those types of things. And so I think that, and lastly, be honest with yourself. Do you have the expertise or the partnership within your organization to manage some of the things that were required from a platform as a service provider versus something that's software as a service? That's a great question.
Okay, question number 2. How can you define a budget for a cloud CMS migration if you aren't sure how much it should cost?
That's a great question. So I would say that, obviously, like we mentioned, establishing understanding what the problem is that you're trying to solve and what the investment level you're willing to make to solve that problem and how that'll bring ROI to your business, I think is the first step in that process, making sure that organizations have the willingness to invest in the stakeholder buy-in before you embark on a project. The last thing you want to do is send out an RFP with requirements in it, but no budget. Because what you're going to get back is a variety a huge range of like, hey, this is a $1 million project, this is a $50,000 project. It doesn't help you determine a budget. You'll just pick something in the middle, statistically speaking, and say our budget's in here somewhere. And then you actually have to go ask for it. So establishing up front, I think, is really, really important. And it should be based on the return on investment that you'll get from making a cloud migration.
Okay, what about organizations that want to deploy to their own Azure environment? Can they still benefit from migrating to the cloud?
Yeah, I think they can. So let's talk about the differences. So, and I'm assuming the person asked the question is considering like, hey, maybe I want to use Umbraco, but maybe I have data regulations. Maybe I'm storing HIPAA data or different type of data that requires us to be in our own Azure fabric, which is governed by our IT team. So you're not moving to something like Umbraco Cloud, where it's being managed by Umbraco in combination with Microsoft. It's being managed by your team internally in combination with Microsoft. So the advantages that we talked about as far as security, scalability, those types of things, those are all, you're going to realize all those benefits going to the cloud, even in your own Azure fabric. The things that you might not be realizing from an ROI perspective are things like automated upgrades for security patches. So a good example is a software manufacturer I saw this morning had a security patch for one of their products. If you were in their cloud, it was already applied last night. If you weren't, it's saying, hey, you got to download this thing and install it in your environment. So you'll lose a little bit of the management portion, kind of the maintenance portion of the equation, but you still can realize all of the benefits that we talked about from a scalability and security perspective.
Okay, what are the advantages of doing a website redesign along with a platform migration versus doing them separately?
That's a good question. So here's the way I look at it. If you're doing a lift and shift, I would say, just move your website to the cloud because it's the easiest path to see immediate ROI. If your plan is to say migrate from Sitecore to Umbraco Cloud and then redesign later, you're already rebuilding the website from all the Sitecore code to all the Umbraco code as part of that process. And so you're almost having to invest twice because when you redesign the website, you're probably going to want to introduce new features and functionality. So in those scenarios, if you are really planning a redesign, it makes more sense to do them again together because the total cost will be much smaller than if you did rebuild the site from Sitecore to Umbraco Cloud, and then 3 months later, redesign the website where you're going to have to change a bunch of the functionality that you just built to match the new design. So I think that if you are planning a redesign, it does make sense to do the redesign effort with the migration to the cloud at the same time.
Okay, got another question here. Is there really any such thing as a lift and shift?
There is a really such thing as a lift and shift. I think that if the model, which I would say is if you're not changing the design and you're not changing the front end framework. So if, for example, the desire is I want to change I want to move from Umbraco to Umbraco Cloud, as an example, and you're using all of the same code, that could definitely be considered a lift and shift. Where things get tricky is if you're moving from, say, Umbraco to Umbraco Cloud, but maybe you want to rewrite the entire front end framework to be using a more modern framework, like a new CSS framework or something. Things start to get slippery at that point where there's no longer a lift and shift. Things aren't going to look the same. And then you start getting into like already redesigning stuff. And so lift and shift, I think if it's constrained to there are no code changes and we're just moving environments. So visit like perpetual hosting from a Rackspace or internal to Umbraco Cloud, I think that could be considered a lift and shift. Anything beyond that gets a little gray in a hurry.
Okay. How do you keep the back office of the same application deployed on two different environments synced?
Good question. So on Umbraco, they have something, there's a variety of products. If you're in their cloud, you can synchronize content to different environments. Also, they also have a third-party add-on called, I think it's USync Complete. And that product you can configure to synchronize between a variety of environments. Could be development, staging, authoring, production, or even different nodes across the globe. So there are products available within the within the Umbraco community that are fully supported that offer that functionality out of the box.
Okay. How do the SLAs differ between PaaS versus SaaS providers?
That's a great question. So when you look at a platform as a service provider, they're providing SLAs on things like the infrastructure, for sure. So that would be the hosting. They're providing SLAs on most likely the CMS itself. Is the Umbraco back office available? They're most likely not providing an SLA on the website being up, meaning you're responsible on a platform as a service for your website to be up or down because you're controlling all of the custom code. So the SLA would be based on that. If you are looking at a software as a service provider, the SLAs will be based on, is the website available, period. Because all the other stuff doesn't matter. The infrastructure is expected to be up, the CMS is expected to be up, and the website is expected to be up. So the SLA will be on website uptime and not necessarily just infrastructure and CMS uptime.
Okay, we've got a final question here. Does it make more sense to upgrade my Umbraco CMS to the latest version or migrate to Umbraco Cloud?
Okay, so I think it depends. So if you kind of peel that back a little bit, if you're on a version, so as many are aware, Microsoft changed how the .NET works. So at one point they introduced .NET Core, which is a more modern, forward-thinking platform. And so if you're on a pre-.NET Core version, of Umbraco, I would say it might make sense to upgrade to .NET Core while you're moving to the cloud. If you're already on the .NET Core version, I would just upgrade it to the latest version and put it in the cloud, and then you can take advantage of their continuous release upgrades. If you're in a situation where you need to move to Umbraco Cloud because you need to get off your existing infrastructure and you're on a pre.NET Core version, so say version 8, it is definitely possible to do that. But long-term strategically, you do want to embark on the effort to move to the newer version of the .NET framework. And that's the same for Umbraco Cloud. That's the same for any other .NET CMS. You should be focusing your efforts on moving to the newer framework, because the old one eventually will end of life. Not anytime soon, but it'll happen over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. All right. Are there any other questions, Arliss, that were in the chat?
Yep. I got one more here that just came in. You mentioned Umbraco having a certain percentage of the company through CMS, although what percentage will Umbraco have in with the hybrid bond, and how will Umbraco inform the client?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. So Umbraco as an organization, right? So the CMS itself is open source. So let me just kind of talk about it at a macro level. The CMS itself is open source. I think it'll always be open source. You can host it wherever you want. It doesn't cost you any money unless you want to buy some of the add-ons. And it's a community-based product. I think that it's, I often refer to as in a vetted open source community versus a community-driven ecosystem. And so that'll always be free. There are add-on products like e-commerce, those types of things, which are add-ons, and I think those are going to continue to show up through acquisition, et cetera, to make Umbraco not only more competitive in the world, but also in the US market, which they're heavily coming into now. I also think Umbraco Cloud as a platform as a service provider is going to, you're going to start to see things in Umbraco Cloud that you might not see necessarily available in the standalone free product. And the reason for that is, as you start to move stuff to the cloud, as we talked about all these advantages of why you would do it, many of the platform as a service providers or even SaaS providers, they do have a headless product called Umbraco Hardcore, which is SaaS. You start to see where they can take advantage of multi-tenancy models where they can create something in the cloud that can be deployed to all of their clients. So it'll be free for anybody in the cloud, but perhaps if you wanted to use it in your own environment, say your own Azure Fabric, it may not be available, or it may carry a cost because there's no cost advantages for them like they can have in the cloud. So I'm not totally clear on the question, but I hope that answered it. Happy to elaborate further if you need more.
And that was it for the questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We have our contact information here should you have any follow-up questions. And Karen, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris, for this super insightful lesson today. I personally, for me, the considerations around security and compliance were just very, very knowledgeable and amazing job. So everyone, please join me in thanking our wonderful business partners over at Diagram and Chris. As he mentioned, please feel free to reach out. You see Chris's contact information at Diagram on your screen right now, or you can always visit us online at umbraco.com, where we'd be happy to schedule any additional time with you if you want to see a demo or if you have any questions. We work very closely with our friends at Diagram. So thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your schedule today to join us. Certainly happy to have you all here. And thank you again to our wonderful business partner, Diagram, especially Chris here. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.